In the last video, we talked about magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, and we said that there were two types, structural and functional. We talked about how structural MRI throws the spin of a hydrogen atom off kilter, measures the time it takes for it to return to normal, and turns that into a brain image. In this video, we're going to talk about functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, which is a bit more complicated than structural MRI, but it can measure which parts of your brain are active. And before we get started, just a mild trigger warning, we're going to be talking about blood. The brain, just like any other part of the body, gets its nutrients and oxygen from the blood. And when parts of it are active, blood flow to that part of the brain goes up. When we analyze the image later on, software can tell us where in the brain that rise in blood flow and activity happened. So if part of your brain is really active, you'll see a bigger change in blood flow than if it's just a little bit active. And after analyzing the scan with the software, the parts of the brain with more blood flow are then represented with a color, almost like a temperature scale on a weather map. Now, one of the main components of blood is oxygen, which is carried on a molecule called hemoglobin, and hemoglobin in the blood can be oxygenated or deoxygenated depending on whether it's carrying oxygen. So let's say you're having a conversation with a friend. At that point, the language centers in your brain would be active, so you would see more blood flow and more oxygenated hemoglobin there than in other parts of the brain. So the activity in those language centers would be labeled with color by the software we talked about. So fMRI, like structural MRI, also looks at water molecules, but it's different in that it can also pick up brain activity by looking at how the water molecules act around oxy and deoxyhemoglobin. But how do we know the difference between hydrogen atoms, oxyhemoglobin, and deoxyhemoglobin? When hemoglobin is carrying oxygen, it acts very differently under a magnetic field than when it's not carrying oxygen. And this next part will build from the last video on MRI, so please go check that out. Now, fMRI measures how the water molecules react to oxy and deoxyhemoglobin. The next video will cover this in depth, but for now, just know that deoxyhemoglobin gives off its own magnetic field, while oxyhemoglobin doesn't. This makes it so the water molecules around deoxyhemoglobin give off a slower signal than the water molecules around oxyhemoglobin. So when oxyhemoglobin increases in the active parts of the brain, it takes away a bit of that disturbance, letting that signal from the hydrogen atoms be picked up sooner. So really and truly, the signal comes from the hydrogen in the water molecules, and fMRI distinguishes its spin realignment when more oxyhemoglobin is there, and its spin alignment when more deoxyhemoglobin is there. Now, this is really useful to know things like what each and every part of the brain does, how they're connected, and which parts are active when you're at rest versus when you're focusing on something like reading, and how activity in different parts of the brain will change in neurological disorders like ADHD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and many more. And that's only some of the many applications of fMRI. And to match each and every structure to a function, we need to keep doing more research.